Oh my goodness, you're going to enjoy chapter 11. And when I show you the picture that Ralph Ray drew, the little sketch right at the very beginning of the chapter, you're going to have a little bit of an idea of the excitement to come in this chapter. Just take a look at that picture. What do you suppose Nick is going to be up to this time? Chapter 11 of The Lion's Paw by Rob White. One more time, well, not one more time, we're going to do it with each chapter. Remind you that we are very thankful for the folks at AW Inc., especially Leslie Saunders, who have given us permission to read this wonderful children's novel to you kids who are home staying away from other folks to help to keep from spreading this virus that's such a problem in our country right now. We'll all be glad when this emergency is over, but while it's going on, we'll do what we can to make things better. And I think you're probably enjoying this book, at least I am. And we're all the way up to chapter 11. So let's read it together. Chapter 11. When Penny woke up, it was broad daylight. For a little while, she lay in bed wondering why Ben hadn't waked her. Then she began to fear that something had gone wrong. She jumped out of bed, glanced at Nick sound asleep in his bunk, and putting on her clothes, ran up the companion ladder. It was a beautiful day. The sloop was anchored as usual in a little hidden creek so that the jungly growth, clean and green in the sunlight, was close to it. As Penny came out on deck, 7 white herons rose in silent flight and glided away, their long legs streaming out behind them. Penny noticed that the sails were furled, everything shipshape. She felt a little angry at Ben as she went below again. He should have waked her up and let her stand her watch the way they had agreed. He must have stayed at the tiller almost all night. Penny also had a little feeling of guilt because, for the first time since they had run away, she felt wonderful. Every day up until now, she had felt tired or hurt in one place or another, her feet after the long walk, her hands after the rowing. But this morning, she felt wonderful all over after a whole night's sleep. Penny cooked and ate her breakfast, and afterwards, being as quiet as she could, she made some biscuits because all the loaf bread they had started with was gone. By the time she got the biscuits done, Nick woke up, and a little while later, Ben. "There's a town a few miles from here," Ben said. "I'm going up there this morning to get some gear. How big are you, Nick?" Nick looked surprised. "Not very," he said. "I mean, how big around? I want to get you and Penny some clothes." "Not short pants," Nick said. "Anything I can get," Ben said. "Maybe just overalls." "Anything but short pants," Nick said. "How about you, Penny?" "I don't know," Penny said, "but I'd like overalls too. They're cheaper than dresses." Ben got a flexible steel tape out of the toolbox and measured Penny and Ben around the waist and down the leg. He wrote the measurements on a piece of paper. Sitting at the table, Ben rapped on it with his knuckles and spoke to an invisible somebody. "Orderly," he said, "present my compliments to the supply officer and request that he report to my stateroom immediately." Nick looked around for the orderly. "Do we need anything, Penny?" Ben asked. "Bread, unless we're going to bake it ourselves." Ben wrote that down. "Do you want us to do anything while you're gone?" Penny asked. Ben shook his head. "If anybody comes snooping around, tell them that this boat belongs to your brother and that he'll be right back." As Ben started out, Nick put on an innocent expression and said, "Ben, can I go rowing in the dinghy while you're gone? I want to practice." "Go ahead," Ben said. Nick rowed Ben over to the bank and then went back to the Lion's Paw. Penny leaned over and told him not to row out on the lake where somebody might see him. And Nick said, You think I'm crazy? Nick rode innocently around as long as Penny was on deck. But as soon as she went below, he changed course and started purposefully up the creek. In the bottom of the dinghy, he had stowed a boat hook, and concealed in his pocket, he had a length of rope with which to make a noose. Nick had a very determined look in his eye. Soon the winding creek hid him from the sloop, and the water was shallow enough so that he could stand up in the stern and pole the boat along with the boat hook. As Ben had done, he went very slowly and silently and kept watching for alligators. In a little while, he saw one lying in the mud of the bank. Nick almost turned right around and went back, for the gator was 10 feet long, and as he went past it, it turned its head and looked at him with the clear, pale yellow eyes. It opened its jaws wide, and Nick could see the rows of long teeth and the white, flabby-looking inside of its mouth. Farther on, he saw another one, but it was big too, and as soon as he got close to it, it waddled slowly down across the muddy bank and slid into the water. For a little while, he could see where it was going by the hump it made in the water and the trail of mud, but finally, it disappeared altogether. He saw 3 more, but they all slid off into the water before he could get near them. At last, he was so far up the little creek that there was hardly room enough for the dinghy to move, and when it finally stopped, stuck in the mud, Nick stood for a moment half disappointed and half relieved. He had to admit that he was a little afraid of the alligators, especially hunting them this way all by himself. Maybe he ought to get Penny to help him. Nick pushed the dinghy out of the mud and turned it around. Then, as he started to go back, he saw, in the mud of the bank, some tracks. They weren't like the others he had seen, which had big, sloppy footprints on each side of a wavy, slick line where the alligator's tail had dragged. These were little. The footprints were clear where the toes dug into the mud, and the line the tail made between them was just a slick place on the mud. The footprints went away from the creek. Looking around to be sure there were no big ones watching him, Nick pushed the bow of the dinghy into the mud bank and climbed out. He sank into the mud almost to his knees, but as he followed the little claw marks, the mud got better, down to his ankles. He lost the little track in some leaves, then found it again farther on. In one place, the alligator had just wandered around, but then it had started on again. Nick followed the tracks until they led him to a little pool of water left by the rain. As he came toward it, he at last saw the alligator as it slid down into the water. It was about 8 inches long, and its scales, unlike those of the big ones, were clean and yellow with blackish spots on them. Nick slogged his way to the edge of the pool and looked down into the inch-deep water. The alligator had made a curving line of mud out to the middle of the pool, but there it ended in a little cloud of muddy water. Around him, the woods were silent. Far away in a circle, Nick could hear things, bugs and birds and a squirrel. But right where he was, there wasn't a sound. And nothing moved, not even the little green leaves at the tops of the trees. Nick looked all around to be sure that no big alligators were watching him. Then, going very slowly and trying his best not to muddy the water, He waded out into the little pool. He stopped a foot or so from the last trace of the alligator and waited, standing perfectly still until the mud he and the gator had made settled like wet brown dust to the bottom. Looking down through the clear water now, he could see where the little alligator had gone under the mud. It had made an outline of its body in the smooth mud so that he could see where its head was, and there was a thin line marking the tail. Very carefully, Nick reached down, his fingers open and ready to grab. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. As his fingers touched the surface of the water and slid down into it, Nick held his breath. As his fingers touched the mud, he suddenly shoved down hard and grabbed. He had it! Through the oozing mud in his hand, he felt the rounded body thrashing back and forth. Jerking his hand out, he held the muddy alligator up as its little feet on the short legs clawed uselessly at his hand, and its little mouth opened and snapped shut as fast as it could. The yellow eyes, clear of mud, blazing at him. Nick was surprised by the grunting noise the little gator made. Holding the gator tightly, Nick washed him off in the pool, and then, feeling jubilant, he began slogging his way back to the dinghy. The alligator kept on grunting. He had almost reached the boat and was floundering in mud up to his knees when he heard the noise behind him. It was a loud, abrupt hissing sound, and he twisted around to see what it was. Coming toward him through the mud, its pale yellow eyes fixed on him, its body held up clear of the mud on the short legs, was an enormous alligator hissing through the two little nostrils on the end of its bony snout. For a second, Nick stood in the mud, petrified with fear, as the alligator rushed toward him. And then, with all his strength, he plowed toward the dinghy, his legs fighting the clawing mud, his hands and arms waving around to keep him from falling off balance. Once he looked back over his shoulder, and the alligator was moving much faster than he was. When Nick half fell over into the dinghy, the gator was only a few feet away and coming fast. Dropping the little alligator, Nick grabbed an oar, shoved the dinghy's bow out of the mud, and swung it downstream. As the big gator came hissing down the bank and into the water, Nick grabbed the other oar and fitted both of them into the oar locks. For a moment, the alligator disappeared in the muddy water, and as Nick began to row, he thought that it had gone. Bracing his feet, he threw all of his weight against the oars, and the dinghy began to slide away. Then, behind the dinghy, Nick saw the moving hump of water. At first, it was just rounded and smooth, but then it began to stretch out, getting thinner and thinner, and suddenly the gator's long head and scaly back broke through the surface. The knobs where the eyes were making two long ripples, and its beating tail sending waves of muddy water washing against the bank. Nick rowed harder. His breath was now dry as dust in his throat, and he could hear it rasping back and forth as he tried to breathe. His arms and legs began to feel like bags full of water with no strength in them, and the pumping of his heart felt as though it would break through his ribs. With easy, powerful strokes of its tail, the gator gained on him fast, the little eyes sliding toward him and watching him, the hump of the nostrils cutting the water like the bow of a boat. Nick stopped rowing and grabbed the boat hook, which was of white oak with a handle about 6 feet long, equipped with a brass fitting on the end, which had a spike ending in a little ball and a curved brass hook. Crouching in the stern of the boat, Nick clubbed the boat hook and waited. The alligator came straight at him, the little eyes baleful and steady, the tail making a swishing noise in the water. With all of his strength, Nick brought the boat hook down on the snout, the brass fitting banging the lump where the nostrils opened and making the pole shiver in his hand. The gator disappeared in a mass of foam and mud as it seemed to hump up in the middle and thrash with its whole body. Nick reached for the bottom with the boat hook and leaned all his weight on it, shoving the dinghy fast downstream. He reached again, shoved, jerked the end out of the clinging mud, and shoved again, the water getting deeper and deeper, the dinghy going in sudden leaps and gliding stops. The alligator appeared suddenly right astern. It came whooshing up through the muddy water, and as it broke the surface, it opened its jaws and came for the dinghy. To Nick, it seemed that everything stopped moving except the rushing jaws of the gator. The creek, the woods, the sky were silent, and the sunlight made everything crystal clear. He saw muddy water in the bottom of the dinghy. He saw the little alligator lying motionless but still grunting on the yellow varnished blade of one of the oars. He saw a turtle, its shell glossy, sitting on a log. He saw the teeth of the alligator's upper jaw and saw a silver drop of water fall from one of them. The inside of the thing's mouth was soft looking and dead white and wet, and it hung in smooth folds from the top jaw, sagging in the bottom of the mouth. Back where the throat was, the white folding flesh looked as though it were puckered up a little, closing the throat. Muddy water swirled slowly around the lower front teeth. The gaping jaws seemed to grow bigger and bigger as they swam straight toward him. To Nick, the white, tooth-ringed mouth seemed to be huge, engulfing everything. For long seconds, Nick squatted perfectly still in the bilges of the dinghy as the jaws slid swiftly toward him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move a muscle as he stared at the jaws. And then everything broke apart like an explosion. In the woods, jaybirds began suddenly to screech. The turtle slid with a splash off the log. The little alligator scurried up the side of the dinghy and fell back on the oar. Nick lunged forward with the boat hook and watched the brass fitting, bright in the sunlight, go in between the two jaws, go on until it disappeared into the puckered folds of the white flesh back where the throat was. The top jaw came down with a crash, which tore the boat hook out of his hands and flailed it around, banging it against the dinghy. Again and again, the jaws opened and crashed shut, sending showers of water away from the head. Then 3 feet of the handle of the boat hook floated away on the wild water, and the alligator began to whirl over and over, its great tail rising from the water and flailing down again, thrashing the stream into a froth of mud and water. Hanging on with both hands to the wildly pitching dinghy, Nick got back to the thwart, shoved the oars out, and began to row. Sweat and muddy water streamed into his eyes. He rammed the boat against the bank, backed it off, and went ahead again. He was half blind, but he could still hear the thrashing of that alligator. Missing a stroke, Nick clawed the sweat and water out of his eyes and looked up the creek. The beast was still whirling round and round, its back thrusting up for a moment, then its white, smooth belly, the little legs clawing the empty air, and then the back again. He could hear the squishy snapping of the jaws as they opened and shut. When he was 50 feet from the lion's paw, Nick began to yell for Penny. Rowing wildly the dinghy's wake like a crazy snake in the water, he yelled at the top of his lungs and kept on yelling even after he heard Penny answering him. Then, when the dinghy bumped into the side of the sloop, Nick collapsed. He turned loose the oars, and one of them slid out of the oarlock and floated away. "Nick, what's the matter? What's the matter?" Penny asked, her voice full of fear as she leaned over the side of the sloop. "Alligator got me," Nick said between pants. "Big jaws, bite, chased me, boat, hook, right in two." What? Penny asked. Nick took a deep breath and looked up into the frightened face of his sister. "I said, a gator got me," he said. "How? Where?" Penny asked, her voice rising. Nick let the breath out and tried to stand up, but his knees had gone, and he sat down again with a wet thump. "The boat hook's gone," he said in a low voice. "He bit it right in two." "Nick," Penny said sternly, "get out of that boat and come up here." "I can't," Nick said. "I haven't got any knees." "Are you crazy? What happened?" "An alligator tried to eat the dinghy," Nick said, "while I was in it." "Oh, Nick," Penny said, "you ought to have your mouth washed out with soap." "He bit the boat hook right in two. He's back there now going round and around." "Really?" Penny said, her voice low. "He was huge," Nick said. "He was as long as the lion's paw, and his mouth was white inside. Is he coming?" Nick shook his head. "I fixed him. I put the boat hook all the way down his throat." "Nick, please get out of that boat and tell me what happened." "All right." Nick retrieved the floating oar, and then, as he was about to climb out, he remembered the little alligator. It had disappeared, and he began frantically searching for it in the bilge water and under the oars. "What's the matter now?" Penny asked. "I've lost my alligator." Penny straightened up and looked down into the dinghy. "Nick, what's the matter with you?" she asked slowly. Then Nick found the little alligator far up in the bow. When he got it by the tail, it whipped around and tried to bite him. He grabbed it with his other hand and held it up. "See," he said. Penny looked at the little alligator in amazement. "You really did," she said slowly. After Penny and Nick had got the dinghy cleaned out, the alligator in a basin with some water in it, and Nick had removed some of the mud, the story about the alligator had been told 5 times. And when Ben came back in the afternoon, it had to be told 2 or 3 more times. And finally, all 3 of them went back up the creek to see where it had happened. Nick, who was afraid that maybe they didn't believe all of it, was happier after they found the end of the boat hook, the oak handle chewed through. They found nothing else. Back on the sloop, the dinghy upside down abaft the mast, Ben showed them the stuff he had bought. Overalls, stiff and new, some cotton shirts, a straw hat for each one of them, and some underclothes. Then from another paper package, he unfolded 2 cotton nightgowns with little birds printed on them. "These are yours," he said to Penny. "Nick, here's some pajamas for you." Penny retired to the galley to try on first her nightgowns and then the shirts and overalls. The nightgowns were just right, but the other things were too big. "They'll shrink plenty," Ben said. He had also bought 2 combs, some toothbrushes and powder, some high-smelling soap in cakes shaped like animals, and some towels. After supper, as they sat around waiting for dark, Ben pulled out a torn piece of newspaper. "They're still after us," he said. "I noticed this in a paper, and I swiped it." "Runaway children disappear," Ben read the headline. "The 3 children, 2 of them escaped orphans, who ran away in a sailboat, have disappeared, according to Mr. Peter Lanford of this city. 6 days ago, Mr. Lanford's nephew, Benjamin R. Sturgis, 15, the son of the well-known yacht builder, Lieutenant Ben Sturgis, who was killed while on active duty in the Navy, ran away in Lieutenant Sturge's sloop, Heart of Lee. It is believed he is accompanied by 2 children, brother and sister, who had escaped from the local orphanage. No trace has been found of this sloop, although a coastwise search has been conducted by the Coast Guard, Navy, and Merchant Marine. And Mr. Lanford now fears that the boat may have been wrecked and the children lost. Mr. Lanford reports that he has received many false clues to the whereabouts of his boat, and people have reported sighting it as far south as Key West and as far north as Norfolk. Mr. Lanford, who is offering $500 reward, has thoroughly investigated each of these reports, but has found them all to be false. Anyone knowing or hearing about such a boat or seeing any of the children is requested to telephone or wire collect to Mr. Peter Lanford, 2719 Vala Vista Drive of this city. Ben crumpled the paper into a ball and threw it up into the cockpit. I think we fooled him, Ben said. It doesn't say a word about searching in the Gulf of Mexico. You know, Penny said quietly, I wish there was some way we could let your Uncle Pete know that we're all right. I have, Ben said. There was a truck at a filling station going to Miami. I wrote a note to one of the boys who used to work with Dad, asking him to tell Uncle Pete that we were all right. The truck driver said he would mail it when he got to Miami. Suppose he doesn't, Penny asked. Suppose he gets suspicious and opens it. Well, he didn't look very suspicious. He looked sort of dumb. But anyway, even if he opened it and read it, it wouldn't make much sense to him because Dad used to call Uncle Pete Sluggo. And I just said in the note, please tell Sluggo we're all fine and not to worry. Jimmy will know that I sent it, and he'll remember Dad calling Uncle Pete Sluggo. He'll think we're in Miami, Nick said. Ben nodded. At least I hope he will. Anyhow, if everything goes wrong, the driver gets suspicious or the man at the filling station or somebody has seen the boat today, it won't make any difference. In an hour, we'll be gone. Tomorrow, we'll be in the Gulf. Penny sighed. Nick said, what's the Gulf like, Ben? Oh, about the same as the Atlantic. Not as rough, and it's more tropical. And there aren't any alligators, not where we're going. Nick shrugged. I don't care. I've already got one. It's a wonder he didn't get you, Ben said. All right, let's get rolling. Penny, you catch the long one tonight from here to Alva. Nick will take her from Alva to Fort Myers, and I'll take her down to the bay. The LionsPaw, in the cover of darkness, ghosted out of Lake Apache and turned west again toward the Gulf of Mexico, and they thought the end of being pursued. And that's the end of chapter 11.